I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be here to celebrate the work of Charles Taylor and his birthday in such convivial and stimulating company, renewing old friendships and making new ones. I've learned a lot from Charles Taylor, both from print and in person, and you will be able to discern his presence in the background of this talk and perhaps also in the foreground. So it's a pleasure to be here and to thank and honor Charles on this occasion. By secularism, or more specifically political secularism, I mean institutional arrangements such that religious authority and religious reasons for action on the one hand, and political authority and political reasons for action are distinguished. So political authority does not rest on religious authority, and the latter does not dominate political authority. Support for such arrangements can be derived from a religion or a religious authority, and certainly are supported by many religious people. On this very broad conception of political secularism, there is no necessary absolute separation of religion and political rule, let alone that the state should be hostile to religion. Many different institutional arrangements and many different political views and ideologies are consistent with this minimal conception of secularism, which is basically the non-domination of political authority by religious authority. I take subscription to this idea to be central to modernity and therefore one of the dominant ideas of the 20th century. I do not mean that everybody in modern societies agrees with this view, and of course, like all ideas, it is not perfectly or purely manifested in any actual case, and people will disagree about the specific cases. Nevertheless, like democracy, political secularism is a hegemonic idea that most people actively and passively support, and few argue against in a full-throated way. An increasing number of academics think that in recent years, something highly significant, possibly epochal, has happened to this state of affairs. Established modern societies are producing critics of this taken-for-granted idea in their midst, and emergent modern societies do not seem to be smoothly following in the path that led to the historical ascendancy of political secularism. My interest is specifically in Western Europe, unlike Jose's global range. Jürgen Habermas, who has Western Europe very much at the forefront of his mind, has famously announced that we're currently witnessing a transition from a secular to a post-secular society, in which secular citizens, that's his phrase, secular citizens have to express a previously denied respect for religious citizens who should be allowed, even encouraged, to critique aspects of contemporary society and to find solutions to its problems from within their religious views. Instead of treating religion as sub-rational and a matter of private concern only, religion is once again to be recognized as a legitimate basis of public engagement and political action. Some have gone further and speak of, I quote, a contemporary crisis of secularism. And that today, another quote, today political secularisms are in crisis in almost every corner of the globe. Olivier Roy, in an analysis focused on France, writes of the crisis of the secular state. And my friend Rajiv Bhargava, part of this conference, speaks of, I quote, the crisis of the secular state in Europe. Of course, there is a larger and more specifically sociological thesis about desecularization across the world, about the development of modern economies and institutions without a decline, and indeed by some reversal, of an earlier decline in religious belief and practice. My interest is limited to the phenomenon of public religion, and so of how religion is fighting back from its political marginalization. Across the globe, across the globe, religious groups are protesting against perceived demotion or marginalization in the public space. Yet, while in most parts of the world, the protesters seek to restore a real or more probably imagined past, a golden age before the marginalization, this is not the case in Western Europe. More fundamentally, while in the other regions there's a sense that a religious majority has been or is being marginalized, in Western Europe, the group most expressing its sense of marginalization is a minority. So while the religionist agitation in the US, the Muslim world, and India is about the status and re-empowerment of the religious majority, of making the country in the image of the religious majority, the issue in Europe is about the status of a minority and its right to change the countries that it has recently become a part of or is trying to be accepted as a part of. Insofar as the dominant religion, Christianity, exhibits a newfound political assertiveness, it is in reaction to the minority presence in politics and in a context of continuing decline in Christian religiosity and church membership. The majoritarian reaction is sometimes in terms of a sympathetic multiculturalism, sympathetic multiculturalist or multi-faith accommodation, but all too often and growingly in secularist and Christianist oppositional modes. The majority are reacting to the minority, not to the felt constraints of secularism. And so the form of the challenge is not a religious resurgence, but an ethno-religious multiculturalism. Indeed, not post-secularism, but secularism or neo-secularism is one of the leading majoritarian responses, especially in France. Of course, the group I'm very much talking about are Muslims in Western Europe, and I have some data about them and so on, which I don't have time to present. It is available, or we might want to discuss it later. The core element of the challenge is the primacy given to religion as the basis of identity, organization, political representation, normative justification, and so on. But it is not the presence of Muslims or Islam that creates a challenge all by itself. It is the presence of Muslims mediated by or in interaction with contemporary values of European states and politics. In particular, we should attend to two key complexes of political ideas, norms, and practices which predate and are independent of Muslim immigrant politics, but which make available a certain political opportunity structure for Muslims to make claims which create majoritarian and secularist anxieties. Muslims have been able to adapt and utilize these evolving political complexes, and this gives a distinctive character to the phenomenon of interest. So the first one of these complexes is not to do with secularism or desecularization or public assertive religions per se, but with the claims for accommodation from within Western polities and normative viewpoints in relation to minorities generally. Let us call these debates and activities multiculturalism. These discourses and practices of non-discrimination, rights, equal accommodation and respect are largely discourses from within Western European normative debates, norms and laws. They're picked up post-immigration, and when Muslims or other groups utilize them, the reference is to the status and resources available to other groups in the West, not homelands. And I'm going to say no more really about multiculturalism than that. I just assume everybody will understand what I'm referring to. The second complex I have in mind is the religion-state linkages and support structures that exist in Western European countries, which I'll call moderate secularism. So I turn to this second complex that I think relates to this sense of crisis of secularism. It is undeniably true that in terms of vocabulary, concepts, and institutional practices, each country in Western Europe is a secular state. But each has its own distinctive take on what this means. Nevertheless, there are two historical strands, a main one and a lesser strand. The latter is principally manifested in French laïcité, which seeks to create a public space in which religion is virtually banished in the name of reason and emancipation, and religious organizations are monitored by the state through consultative national mechanisms. The main Western European approach, however, which I call moderate secularism, sees organized religion not just as a private benefit, but as a potential public good or national resource, and which the state can, in some circumstances, assist to realize, even through an established church. These public benefits can be direct, such as a contribution to education and social care through autonomous church-based organizations funded by the taxpayer, or indirect, such as the production of attitudes that create economic hope or family stability, and they can be to do with national identity, cultural heritage, ethical voice, and national ceremonies. Western Europe has been a site of a historical struggle between public churches and political secularists, which for the most part was not deeply conflictual during the 19th and especially the 20th century, especially in Protestant majority societies, and was undertaken through various shifting compromises. The compromises consisted of a successful accommodation of an expanding number of Christian churches within the business and symbolic workings of the state, yet marked by a gradual but decisive weakening of the public and political character of the churches. The 1960s till the end of the century saw a particularly strong movement of opinion and politics in favor of the secularists. In Western Europe, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s has been broadly accepted. Not only has there been no major sustained counter-movement, but it broadened out from northwestern Protestant/secular Europe into Catholic Europe. So, for example, the national system of pillarization in the Netherlands, by which Protestants and Catholics had separate access to some of the state's resources, which emerged in the 19th century, declined sharply in the middle of the 20th and was formally wound up in 1983. The Lutheran Church in Sweden was disestablished in 2000. In the UK, disestablishment of the Church of England was embraced in the early 1990s by key sections of the centre-left. Catholic countries, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, in the 1980s and 1990s showed rapid signs of the secularization characteristic of Protestant Europe. Of course, this is not meant that public religion, even the formal connections to the state and direct access to governments, disappeared altogether. There has been a trend towards less public recognition, but it has not led to anything like a terminal endpoint, not even in France. Nor, on the other hand, has there been much political challenge from organized religion or political conflict involving religion, Northern Ireland's exceptional character proving the rule. The place of religion in Western Europe has been relatively uncontroversial in the last decades of the 20th century because religion has not been particularly visible, and there has been a general assumption, perhaps shared by many religious people, perhaps even by religious lobbies, that the decreasing public presence of religion is irreversible, and it is better to flow with it than either a political fight to reverse the trend or to take decisive action to its endpoint. Religion did not cease to be public, but because it was not felt to be too challenging or threatening, it was noticed less. For example, a political campaign on a religious matter or led by religious people was less likely to be reported by the media than, say, an anti-racist or an environmentalist protest. So this is the context, then, in which non-Christian migrants have been arriving and settling, and in which they and the next generation have become active members of their societies, including making political claims of equality and accommodation. So the important point is that the rising multicultural challenge and the gradual weakening of the political status of Christian churches, in particular the national churches, were taking place at the same time. The intersection of these two trajectories is nicely captured in two policy initiatives in the Netherlands in 1983. In that year, in which the national system of pillarization, which had at one time made the country a bi-religious communal state, was formally wound up, a new minorities policy, nota minderhendenbeleid, if that is recognizable to anybody, a new minorities policy was announced that created post-immigration ethnic minorities as a de facto mini-pillar, giving them state funding for faith schools, ethno-religious radio and TV broadcasting, and other forms of cultural maintenance. Some of that policy began to be reversed in the 1990s. But looking beyond the Netherlands, the pivotal moment, in Western Europe, the pivotal moment was 1988-89 and was marked by two events. These created national and international storms and set in motion political developments which have not been reversed and offer contrasting ways in which the two Western European secularisms are responding to the Muslim presence. The events were the protests in Britain against the novel The Satanic Verses by Sir Salman Rushdie, and in France, the decision by a school head teacher to prohibit entry to 3 girls unless they were willing to take off their headscarves in the school premises. The novel, The Satanic Verses, was not banned in the UK as the protesters demanded, and the conduct of some Muslims, especially those threatening the life of the author, certainly shocked and alienated many of the campaign. In that sense, the Muslim campaign clearly failed. In other respects, however, it galvanized many into seeking a democratic multiculturalism that was inclusive of Muslims. A national body was created to lobby on behalf of Muslims in the corridors of power. This new body, the Muslim Council of Britain, or MCB, was accepted as a consultee by the new Labour government of 1997 till about the middle of the next decade, when it looked for new interlocutors. The government looked for new interlocutors mainly because of the foreign policy issues, but in the end it went back to the MCB because it couldn't find any other interlocutors. The MCB was very successful in relation to its founding agenda. By 2001, it had achieved its aim of having Muslim issues and Muslims as a group recognized separately from issues of race and ethnicity, and of being itself accepted by government, media, and civil society as the spokesperson for Muslims. Another 2 achieved aims were the state funding of Muslim schools on the same basis as Christian and Jewish schools, and in getting certain educational and employment policies targeted on the severe disadvantage of the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, who are nearly all Muslims, as opposed to on minority ethnicity generally. Additionally, it played a decisive role in getting Tony Blair to go against ministerial and civil service advice and insert a religion question into the 2001 census. This meant that the ground was laid for the possible later introduction of policies targeting Muslims to match those targeting groups defined by race and ethnicity, or gender. The MCB had to wait a bit longer to get the legislative protection it sought. Laws against religious discrimination were introduced in 2003, strengthened in 2007, and again in 2010, making them much stronger than anything available in the rest of the European Union. Incitement to religious hatred, the legislation most closely connected to the protests over the Satanic Verses, was introduced in 2006, though there is no suggestion that it would have caught the novel. Indeed, the protesters' original demand that the blasphemy law be extended to cover Islam has been made inapplicable as the blasphemy law was abolished in 2008, with very little protest from anybody. So that is one path of development from 1988 to 89. As can be seen, it was a mobilization of a minority and the extension of minority policies from race to religion in order to accommodate the religious minority. The other development, namely the one arising from the l'affaire Foulard, was one of top-down state action to prohibit certain minority practices. From the start, the majority of the country, whether it be media, the public intellectuals, the politicians, or public opinion, was supportive of the head teacher who had refused to have religious headscarves in school. Muslims either did not wish to or lacked the capacity to challenge this dominant view with anything like the publicity, organization, clamor, or international assistance that Muslims in Britain brought to bear on Rushdi's novel. So, of course, the banning, then that led to the banning of headscarves, which more recently has led to the banning of face veils. But at the same time, there's been a kind of state-down, a top-down consultation with Muslims, creating bodies for consultations, like the Council of French Muslims that Nicolas Sarkozy created in 2003. So I won't go into more detail of that, as I don't have time. And just in passing, on my way to a conclusion, I'll mention a couple of kind of more recent kind of strands of public opinion that have emerged. One of them you could refer to as people asserting that Europe or a particular country, Britain, say, Germany, say, is a Christian country or should reflect Christian values. That's one strand. And another strand is where people refer to liberalism as having to stop being tolerant of everything, especially things that should really be, it should be intolerant of because they are illiberal. And that's sometimes referred to in a phrase that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, has coined as muscular liberalism. So I won't say anything more about any of those things. And of course, a very important point, which I'm not touching on here, well, I do in the paper, is that this is all happening in the context of rising Islamophobia, both at kind of public opinion levels, but also in terms of some organized politics, far-right politics, which also then begins to influence mainstream debates as well. So wrapping it up, I would say that despite these different and distinct strands, some of which I've had to very, very briefly just gesture towards, I would say that the real choice that is emerging, you know, you might say, well, there are kind of three different groupings emerging in different countries, and especially within these two different kinds of secularism. There's a Muslim voice, often supported in a kind of interfaith way by some other groups, including some Christian groups. There is a more, what we might call a Christianist voice, assertive voice, perhaps in some ways epitomized and led by Pope Benedict. And there is this kind of secularist voice. You might say, how will this triangular relationship resolve itself? Well, I think in the end, really, the real choice is not primarily about secularism, but is between a pluralist, multi-faith nationality or Europeanism on the one hand, and a monoculturalist nationalism or Europeanism on the other. Or, to put it another way, the crisis of secularism is best understood within a framework of multiculturalism. And of course, Western European commentary is full of the claim that multiculturalism is dead, I mean, from the very top to the bottom. But if these issues were dead, we would not be having a debate about the role of public religion or coming up with proposals for dialogue with Muslims and the accommodation of Islam. The dynamic for change is not directly to do with the historic religion nor the historic secularism of Western Europe. Rather, the novelty, which then has implications for Christians and secularists, and to which they are reacting, is the appearance of an assertive multiculturalism which cannot be contained within a matrix of individual rights, conscience, religious freedom, and so on. If any of these were different, the problems would be other than they are. Just as today we look at issues to do with, say, women or homosexuality, not simply in terms of rights, but in a political environment influenced by feminism and gay liberation, within a social, political, intellectual culture in which the assertion of positive difference or identity is a shaping and forceful presence, it does not mean that everybody is a feminist now, but a heightened consciousness of gender and gender equality creates a certain gender equality sensibility. Similarly, my claim is that a multiculturalist sensibility today is present in Western Europe, and yet it is not comfortable with extending itself to accommodate Muslims, but nor able to find reasons for not extending to Muslims without self-contradiction. Thank you.